Story 1. This happened around 2013 or 2014 when my little brother, who was about 7 or 8 years old at the time, and I had just moved with our parents into a new house. The move was to be closer to school and save on rent. The house was nice enough, and it even had a cozy fireplace, which was great for the colder months. My brother was really into Batman back then and had this Batman car that lit up and made noises when you pressed a button. It was his absolute favorite toy, and he played with it all the time. One afternoon, he came running inside from playing in the backyard and said he had found something. Naturally, my mom and I were curious and asked him what it was. He held up a small school photo of a young boy. It was one of those wallet-sized pictures you get when your parents pay for a photo package. The picture was dirty and worn, so much so that the year on it was no longer visible. We thought it was probably a picture some neighbor kid had lost. No big deal. But then my brother said something strange. "That is Buddy," he said with a big smile. I looked at him, confused, and asked him to repeat himself. He pointed at the picture and said again, "This is Buddy. He is my friend." I just nodded slowly, pretending to understand, but it threw me off. My brother was not the type to make friends easily, and he had never mentioned anyone named Buddy before we moved into this house. I figured he must have made a new friend from the neighborhood, but it was odd that this picture would be connected to it. Still, I let it go. That night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up to hear my brother talking. Annoyed, I got up to tell him to go back to sleep before he woke up our parents. When I walked into his room, I saw him sitting upright in bed, looking like he was talking to someone. But he was alone. I told him to go to bed, and he did not argue, so I just went back to my own room. A few days later, my mom mentioned that my brother had been acting strange at night. She asked if I had noticed anything, and I told her about the night I found him talking to himself. She shrugged it off as one of his quirks, and so did I. Now, my bed was positioned so that if I turned over, I could see into the hallway outside my door. One night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Since I have always been scared of the dark, I left the hallway light on before going to bed. As I lay in bed, facing the doorway, I suddenly heard a noise that made me jump. It was my brother's Batman car, lighting up and making its usual noises. Irritated, I got up to tell him to stop playing so late. But when I went into his room, he was fast asleep. The toy, however, was lying on the floor on the other side of the room, still going off. I turned it off and went back to bed, but I could not shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. Over the next few days, my brother kept talking about Buddy. It was starting to freak me out. I decided to check with the neighbors to see if there were any kids my brother might be playing with. One house did not have any children, and the other was vacant. This only made things stranger. When I brought it up to my dad, he said it was probably just an imaginary friend, which made sense for a kid his age. I decided to accept that explanation. But the weirdness did not stop. Almost every night, one of us would hear that Batman car going off, even when no one was in the room. My dad insisted it might be motion activated, but I knew it was not. One night, my sister and I were so unnerved that she decided to sleep in my room for comfort. We stayed up talking, trying to distract ourselves, when we heard the toy again. We froze and looked toward my open door, which faced my brother's room. The sight we saw chilled us to the bone. The Batman car rolled past the door all by itself. We screamed and ran to our parents' room. They were furious, thinking my brother was playing a prank. But when they confronted him, his response sent shivers down my spine. "It was not me," he said. "Buddy wanted to play." That night, the toy was thrown in the trash. My dad even took the batteries out to be safe. My sister and I finally felt some relief, until the next day, when my brother had the toy again. My parents accused him of digging it out of the trash, but he swore, "Buddy got it for me." That was the last straw. My dad smashed the toy into pieces and threw it away again, this time making sure it was gone for good. Things settled down for a while. About a week later, we all started to feel normal again, as if Buddy was finally gone. Then, one evening, my mom was cooking on the George Foreman grill in the kitchen. She stepped into the living room to ask us something when we all jumped at the sound of a loud crash. Rushing into the kitchen, we found the grill lying halfway across the room, as if it had been thrown. My mom insisted she had not left it near the edge of the counter, and none of us could explain what had happened. Nothing else happened after that, and we moved out about a year later. To this day, I cannot help but wonder if my brother's imaginary friend, Buddy, was something much more real than we thought. Story 2. When I was just 10 years old, my family moved to a new house in a different town. Starting over in a new place was tough, especially as I was entering 5th grade at a new school. Everyone already knew each other, and I was just some random new kid. To make things even more awkward, at my elementary school, you had to sit with your classmates during lunch, and those first few days felt like an eternity of judgmental stares and whispers. Making friends was not going to be easy. One day, while I was biking around the neighborhood trying to get used to my new surroundings, I met a kid named Dan. He went to a private school, so we did not have any classes together, but we hit it off pretty quickly. A few days later, another kid named Alex showed up at our front door, asking for me. My parents called me to the door, and Alex introduced himself, saying he lived just down the block. He asked if I liked video games, and of course, I said yes. He invited me over to his house to play Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. I did not have the game but had always wanted to try it, so I agreed. When we got to his house, I immediately noticed that it was in rough shape compared to the other homes on the block. The front yard was just patches of dirt, with no grass in sight. Inside, the house was just as messy, with boxes and random junk piled up everywhere. He led me down to the basement, which smelled like a dozen cats lived there, but I did not see any pets. Despite the mess, we spent a couple of hours playing video games, and for a moment, I thought Alex and I might become good friends. But then he started to act off. When I said I needed to go home, he seemed really disappointed and even followed me halfway back to my house before I had to firmly say goodbye. The next day, Alex showed up at our door again, asking to play. This time, we played in my room, but his behavior made me uncomfortable. He would get way too close to me, invading my personal space. The day after that, he came back again, but I told my mom to say I was not feeling well. Later that same day, I went to hang out with Dan. As we biked past Alex's house, he came outside and just stood on the stoop, staring at us. It was awkward, especially since I had just told him I was sick. I mentioned to Dan that Alex seemed a bit odd, and Dan's reaction surprised me. "That whole family's weird," he said. Dan then told me Alex was actually a couple of years older than me. He was 12, which made the whole situation even stranger. From that point on, I decided to avoid Alex. When he came to our door again, my mom told him I was not home. But late that night, I woke up to a cold breeze and realized my window was wide open. I was certain I had closed it before bed. Then I felt something poke my foot. Startled, I looked up to see Alex standing at the foot of my bed. "Be quiet, it's just me," he whispered. My heart was racing as he explained that his parents were fighting, and he wanted to sleep at my house. I told him to leave immediately. Reluctantly, he climbed back out the window, and I locked it behind him before waking up my parents to tell them what had happened. The next day, my parents went to Alex's house to talk to his family. When they returned, they said it did not go well. His mom had screamed at them, laughed in their faces, and refused to take any responsibility for her son's actions. My parents decided not to involve the police since Alex was just a kid, but I was terrified. A few nights later, I woke up to knocking at my window. I did not answer, and the knocking continued for several minutes before finally stopping. When I told my parents, they told me to ignore it, saying Alex was harmless. But then one night, everything escalated. I woke up to the sound of my window shattering. I screamed as I saw Alex climbing through the broken glass. He froze when he heard me yelling and quickly scrambled back out. I ran to my parents' room, waking them up in a panic. My dad ran outside and chased Alex all the way back to his house. Though Alex made it inside before my dad could catch him, my dad pounded on their door until his parents came out. Somehow, my dad convinced them to pay for the window repair in exchange for not calling the police. After that, I never heard from Alex again. I saw him a couple of times over the next few years when we drove past his house, but eventually, his family moved away. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that Alex was capable of something truly dangerous. The memory of him standing in my room that first night still gives me chills, and I often wonder what kind of person he grew up to be. Story 3. Back in 2013 or 2014, my younger brother, Jacob, was about 7 or 8 years old. Our family had just moved into a new house to be closer to school and save some money on rent. It was a pretty decent place, Nothing fancy but cozy enough. One of its highlights was a small fireplace that kept us warm during the cold months. Jacob had a huge obsession with Batman at the time. He had this toy Batmobile that lit up and made all sorts of noises when you pressed a button. It was his absolute favorite, and he played with it constantly. One afternoon, Jacob came running inside after playing in the backyard, clutching something in his hand. "Look what I found," he exclaimed. Curious, my mom and I asked what it was. It turned out to be a small, worn-out school picture of a boy. You know the kind parents pay extra for with the laminated tag on the back. The photo was smudged and beaten up so badly you could barely make out the details, let alone the year it was taken. We assumed some family nearby had lost it. It did not seem like a big deal at first, but then Jacob said something that gave me pause. "That's Buddy," he announced. I just stared at him, my face practically screaming, "Who?" Jacob pointed to the picture and repeated, "Buddy. He is my friend." Now, Jacob was not exactly the social butterfly type. He had trouble making friends and had never mentioned anyone named Buddy before. I chalked it up to him having an overactive imagination and left it at that. Maybe he met some neighborhood kid, I thought, and gave them an imaginary nickname. That night, everything was quiet until about 3 o'clock in the morning when I woke up to the sound of Jacob's voice. Annoyed, I got out of bed and went to his room to tell him to stop talking before he woke our parents. But when I walked in, I found him sitting up in bed, carrying on a full conversation with no one, or at least no one I could see. "Go to sleep, Jacob," I mumbled, shaking my head, and went back to bed myself. A few days later, my mom brought up Jacob's odd behavior over breakfast. "Have you noticed him getting up at night?" she asked. I told her about hearing him talk that one night, but shrugged it off. "He is just being a kid," we both agreed. My bedroom was directly across from the hallway, and my bed faced the door. One night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I always kept the hallway light on because, I will admit, I am still scared of the dark. As I lay there, trying to muster the courage to get up, a sudden noise startled me. The sound of Jacob's Batmobile going off. The beeping and flashing lights pierced the quiet. I stormed into his room, ready to scold him for playing with toys in the middle of the night, only to find him fast asleep. The Batmobile, meanwhile, was on the floor across the room, still going off. I turned it off and went back to bed, but the incident left me feeling uneasy. Over the next week, the Batmobile became a recurring issue. Every other night, someone in the house, my mom, dad, sister, or myself, would hear it start up on its own. We would go in, find Jacob asleep, and have to switch it off. Jacob, meanwhile, would not stop talking about Buddy. It was starting to creep me out. I even checked with the neighbors on either side of our house. One house had no kids, and the other was vacant. My dad dismissed it as Jacob having an imaginary friend, but it felt like more than that. One night, my sister, Grace, and I decided to sleep in my room together because we were both getting freaked out. We stayed up talking, trying to laugh off our nerves, when we heard it again. That cursed Batmobile. We froze and stared at my open door, which had a clear view into Jacob's room. What we saw next made our blood run cold. The Batmobile rolled past the doorway all on its own. No one was there, not even Jacob. We screamed and bolted to our parents' room. My dad, furious, stormed into Jacob's room, convinced it was a prank. But Jacob's sleepy response chilled us even more. It was not me. Buddy wanted to play. That was the last straw. My dad took the Batmobile, removed the batteries, and threw it in the trash. Grace and I were relieved, thinking that was the end of it. But the next day, Jacob had the toy again. "Buddy got it for me," he said matter-of-factly when my mom accused him of fishing it out of the garbage. This time, my dad smashed the toy into pieces and threw it away for good. Jacob was upset, but my parents got him a new Batman action figure to make up for it. Things seemed to settle down after that, and for about a week, we thought Buddy was finally gone. But then, something even more bizarre happened. My mom was cooking chicken on the George Foreman grill in the kitchen when she stepped away for a moment. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash. We rushed into the kitchen to find the grill lying halfway across the room as if it had been hurled. My mom swore it had been nowhere near the edge of the counter, and none of us had any explanation. After that, nothing else happened. We moved out about a year later. To this day, I cannot help but wonder if Jacob's imaginary friend, Buddy, was not so imaginary after all.